Hi everyone, welcome to our Module 29, Unit 6. We're talking about biology, cognition, and learning today. Here are your learning objectives, and here is your vocabulary. So let's talk about the limits of classical conditioning. So behaviorism argues that mental processes are not important and cannot be used scientifically or cannot be studied in that way. Behaviorism does not really take into account biology, and so this module is going to go through some things that surround mental processes and biology that show you how classical conditioning and operant conditioning are all limited by these influences. Many behaviorists years later realized that, especially through technology like fMRI machines, that these were important factors in behavior. So the first experiment related to this is taste aversion. So Garcia and Colling, they were studying radiation and the effects of radiation in rats, and they found that the rats were classically conditioned to avoid the water from the plastic bottles in radiation chambers. So they wanted to test the theory that they can't be equally conditioned to a different stimulus. So they found that even if these rats were sickened several hours after having that novel taste, the rats still avoided that taste afterwards. The sickened rats developed an aversion to taste, but not to sights and sounds. So what this is showing is that certain things can be conditioned, but other things are more difficult. So for example, the rats were not conditioned to be aversive to any sounds or any sights that were in that same room. So there's that natural link between feeling sick and what we ate. So that makes it easier for that association to occur. There is also a taste aversion study with coyotes and wolves eating sheep that were tainted with poison to get them sick. And after this, they experienced an aversion to sheep meat. So they stopped hunting the sheep, which the sheep farmers were very happy about. Conditioning. So the idea here is that conditioning is faster when it's ecologically relevant, meaning they are related to. So for example, the color red is naturally related to sexuality. So women experience increased blood flow during ovulation. There's the red blushed face of flirtation or sexual excitation. And so the pairing of red and sex, like Valentine's Day, love, hearts, red light districts, red lipstick, all of that, studies show that this constant pairing makes people find those wearing red more attractive. But again, there's a biological connection there, an evolutionary connection there, making that easier and faster to learn. So again, there are biological predispositions that make certain behaviors easier to train than others. For example, it'd be harder to teach a pigeon to flap its wings in order to get food than it is to get them to peck to get food, because pecking is a natural behavior linked to eating. So if they're pecking a certain button to get food, that's easier to learn than flapping wings. It's not related to eating. So when animals are trained to do things that are outside of these biological behaviors or biological predispositions, they can experience instinctive drift, which means that they kind of stop doing this behavior, the more awkward behavior, so example, flapping your wings to get food, and they go back to their natural behavior, so pecking. So cognitive influences on conditioning. So there's a few things to go through here. So when they look at cognition, especially in humans, there's a strong link to how we behave and what we think about why a certain consequence happened. So think of operant conditioning. So in alcohol use disorder patients, they received alcohol and it was spiked with a nauseating drug. So those patients that were aware that the nauseating drug was causing them to get sick and not the alcohol itself, those people were less likely to avoid alcohol in the future because they knew that it was the medicine and not the alcohol that made them sick. So there's that cognitive piece that behaviorism leaves out. An animal on a fixed interval reinforcement schedule responds more frequently as the reinforcer approaches. So we've talked about that before, right? So as the time for that fixed reinforcer approaches, they're acting up, and that's showing you that there's a cognitive piece there. There's also something known as latent learning, which is learning that occurs but isn't apparent until there's an incentive. So they had rats who did mazes, and they had rats who would always earn a reinforcer of food and rats that never earned one. And the ones that never earned one were one day given a food reinforcer. And that made it clear that they could run the maze just as fast as those who got the food always. So that you don't need that food reinforcer. There was latent learning, meaning learning you can't directly see occurring despite that. It also showed us that rats can make cognitive maps that are mental representations of their maze. And so again, it's showing us that cognitive piece even in rats. So there's also something known as insight learning, which is a sudden or like aha moment where we are finding a solution to a problem. So it's thinking about a problem without directly interacting with it. We're just sitting there pondering it and we're like, oh yeah, this is what I could do to fix that. That is insight learning. There is intrinsic motivation. This is a desire to perform a behavior well for its own sake. And I'm going to skip here because I want to show you next. Extrinsic motivation is behaving a certain way to gain a reward or avoid a punishment. So this is an outside factor, a reward or a punishment because I do this. Intrinsic is I just want to do this well for the sake of doing it well. That's intrinsic. So we know that rewards are limiting and can even backfire. So if someone has an intrinsic motivation to play soccer, but there's money put on it, or there's consequences or other rewards put on it, that can actually take away intrinsic motivation, that desire just to play soccer because it itself is rewarding. And that's really sad. So children with reading, they found the same thing. Children were actually less likely to read when candy and money were put to the behavior than children who just read for the sake of reading. So it's actually detrimental to their behaviors. So overuse of rewards leads people to seeing their actions as externally controlled and not being internally appealing. And this is known as over-justification. When there's too many rewards or consequences, it takes away that internal appeal. So extrinsic motivation, so some examples to kind of clarify the two. Are you watching this video to earn a good grade, to get college credit? Are you worried about the punishment if you don't watch? So if so, those are all extrinsic motivators. And if there were no rewards tied to this material, would it be enough to learn this psychology material for its own sake? If so, then that's an intrinsic motivator. When we cope with personal problems, there is a cognitive aspect with how we behave. If it's a problem-focused coping mechanism, we alleviate the stress directly. We change the stressor or the way we interact with the stressor itself. And we tend to use this when we feel a sense of control over the situation. We are changing our environment or ourselves, displaying control. When we don't feel in control, we might use an emotion-focused coping where we're alleviating the stress by avoiding or ignoring the stressor and attending to our emotional needs that the situation has caused. So this can be adaptive when we're using healthy coping strategies and in certain circumstances. Point here is that depending on our sense of control over a situation, so it's just our feeling, that will impact how we behave and how we cope. There's also something known as learned helplessness, when we have hopelessness and a passive resignation that an animal or a human learns when unable to avoid repeated aversive events. So in an experiment, 2 rats received a shock. One can stop the shock by turning a wheel. The other can't stop it. The one who couldn't stop it was more susceptible to ulcers and lowered immunity. Martin Seligman found in an old study with dogs. So he had dogs who just received shocks all the time, could not control the shocks. And so they experienced learned helplessness. And when they were put in a situation like this box in the top right, where they just had to jump over this board to get to safe and not being shocked, the dogs didn't even try. They just sat there and cowered and gave up. So that is learned helplessness. So there are more studies on this. So basically nursing homes, people in nursing homes who don't feel like they have any control over their environment, workers, prisoners, children, students, etc. Anyone, if they are given some perceived control over the situation, it will noticeably improve their health. So related to this is internal and external locuses of control. So this is how we perceive our ability to control our world and our life and what happens to us. If we have an external locus of control, then outside forces are controlling our fate. So over here they're saying, there's nothing I can do about my future. Why do these things happen to me? Why should I try? Things are happening to them. Internal locus of control, the person is focused on the idea that they can control their own fate, that I make things happen. They can change things that they don't like by changing their own behavior. So those with internal locus of control achieve more in school, they they acted more independently, they were healthier, and they felt less depressed. They're better also at delayed gratification and coping with stressors. Compared with parents' generation, more Americans now are actually endorsing an external locus of control, and they see perhaps a link to this and an increase in depression and other disorders in these newer generations. So self-control, our ability to control our impulses and delay short-term gratification for longer-term rewards. This is constantly fluctuating. So if we are exerting our willpower by focusing and doing a lot of schoolwork in one day, that depletes our mental energy for self-control on other tasks. So maybe you are less patient with your sibling, or you are less able to avoid the candy in your room that you are trying to avoid because you have exerted so much willpower and self-control and discipline doing your schoolwork that you're unable to exert it on other things. So they also found that exercising willpower depletes our blood sugar and neural activity associated with mental focus. So they gave people natural sugar, so not like, actual sugar, but like an apple or something. And they found that it strengthened people's effortful thinking and their self-control. So takeaways, willpower is a muscle that we can grow, and it's impacted by how much we have to use it. If we're using it for something else, it might be depleted for another thing. Having an internal locus of control leads to happier, healthier life experience. Intrinsic motivation can be reduced by too many extrinsic motivators. Behaviorialism does not take into account insight learning, biological predispositions, latent learning, and the way we think and feel. And people deal with problems with either emotion-based or problem-based focus, but it depends on their feeling of sense of control over the situation. So if they feel a sense of control, they're more likely to use problem-based focus. And that ends our module 29, and I will see you